The air in the ruined hive city is thick with the scent of promethium and ash. Shadows stretch long across shattered spires, and the echo of distant artillery is a rhythm of despair. Once, this place thrummed with life, devotion, and the iron heartbeat of the Emperor's will. Now it is a graveyard for the loyal, a hunting ground for the heretic, and a testament to the fragility of even the most sacred bonds. I remember the first time I saw a brother fall, not in battle against the Xenos or the traitor, but in the silence between commands, in the moment when faith wavered, and the machinery of war chewed the flesh of its own. What becomes of those who fall, those who are left behind, those whose loyalty does not grant them immortality in the Emperor's grace? There is no mercy here, only consequence. Even now I can hear the whispering of the dead, their prayers half remembered and half forgotten, a litany for the lost. And in that whisper, a question lingers. What does it mean to be human in a galaxy that demands divinity? To be a space marine is to transcend mortality, yet to fall is to remember it all at once, the hunger, the pain, the failure. And perhaps in that remembrance, there is a truth the Codex Astartes never teaches. Like the ghost of a dying planet, this story lingers in the shadows of the Imperium. And it begins here. The galaxy will not wait for reflection, neither should you. If the life of a fallen space marine intrigues you, if the weight of survival, faith, and consequence calls to you, then stay with me. Watch closely, because what follows is not a tale of glory but of truth. The kind of truth that the Adeptus Administratum prays you never see. Like, share, and subscribe, for the Emperor's light is fleeting, and stories like this deserve to endure. The battlefield was a cathedral of ruin. Every spire and smokestack a pillar to the Emperor now toppled into chaos. Ash drifted like snow through the blasted streets of Hive Volantis, coating the armor of those few remaining soldiers who still remembered why they fought. I had stepped from the drop pod with certainty, carrying the weight of the chapter's honor and the quiet arrogance of untested faith. My brothers fell beside me with a sound that tore at the marrow, bones snapping against promethium-slicked stone, bolter rounds punching through ceramite as if it were paper. I thought in that instant that death would reveal a kind of clarity, an understanding of the Emperor's will. I was wrong. Clarity did not come. Only chaos, only fire, only the ceaseless grinding hum of war that ignored prayer and begged for endurance. Our objective was simple: hold the Eastern Manufactorum until reinforcements could arrive. The sector had already been overrun by orc warbands, their crude banners snapping in the ash-laden wind, their guttural chants piercing the silence between explosions. I watched as Brother Calvinius raised his chainsword and roared, every syllable of his fury amplified by his armor's vox grill. Yet even his roar was swallowed by the shriek of shelling overhead. And then the heretic shot rang out. A single bolt of green fire, curved in a way no Imperial gun should allow, struck him squarely in the chest plate. He did not fall with dignity. He spasmed, convulsed, and then lay still, the light in his ceramite helmet flickering like a dying candle. I should have felt rage, vengeance, fury, but all I felt was the void left behind, a gnawing hollowness that settled into my chest as though it had been waiting there all along. I realized then, in the chaos of my first real engagement, that war does not honor the living nor the dead. The Codex Astartes speaks of brotherhood, of honor, of unwavering loyalty, but the battlefield speaks only of cost, of who remains to breathe and who does not. Around me, the ground was slick with blood and oil, the fire of crashed sentinel walkers casting distorted shadows on the walls of the Manufactorum. My servitor aide, damaged and whining in mechanical pain, attempted to aid the wounded, its synthetic hands trembling under the weight of bodies far heavier than they should have been. I gripped my bolter tighter, the cold steel grounding me even as my thoughts spiraled into what-ifs. What if I fall next? What if I am left behind? My prayers unanswered, my deeds unrecorded. The orcs surged like a tide, but they were not the only threat. The sky above shimmered with the hiss of unknown artillery, and the vox chimes of our remaining command rang hollowly across the ruins. Our communications had already begun to fail, fractured into pieces like the minds of those who still stood. Brother Valton, the veteran of 36 campaigns, fell to his knees beside me, whispering a prayer to the Emperor that was half lament, half command. I watched his lips move and realized that faith is both armor and vulnerability. It shields you from despair but exposes your very soul to the void. And then another shot, another brother gone. Each loss made the ground more sacred, more cursed. I pressed forward not because of hope, but because hesitation would be an admission of weakness, and weakness is a luxury we never possess. By the time we reached the outer threshold of the manufactorum, the eastern wall was breached, twisted metal and smoking rubble marking the passage of our enemies. I felt the first pang of what I could only describe as survivor's guilt, the unnatural kinship with those who had fallen moments before. Their deaths were not heroic, nor was mine. They were the crude arithmetic of war, a calculus of life and death that the Emperor observed in silence. And yet amid this calculus I could feel the stirrings of something else, a flicker of awareness that to survive is to carry not just your own life, but the weight of all who have fallen beside you. In that flicker I swore not to falter, not to doubt, even as every instinct screamed that the battlefield would claim me next. As I braced against a smoking barricade, the distant sound of a Dreadnought's footfall shook the ground beneath my boots. The echoes were less metallic than spiritual, like the heartbeat of the chapter itself reverberating through the stones of the hive. And in that heartbeat, I realized the edge of faith is not in the battle won or lost, but in standing upright when all the world has fallen. It is in seeing a brother die and choosing, despite the gnawing emptiness, to honor him with your continued breath, your continued fight, your unbroken presence in the Emperor's name. The manufactorum loomed before me, its gates torn and smoke-stained, and somewhere beyond it lay both survival and the certainty that nothing, not even the loyalty of the strongest, protects you from the fall. The inner chamber of the manufactorum smelled of scorched metal and stagnant oil, a sickly perfume that clung to my armor and my lungs alike. Sparks danced along the exposed conduits as the structure convulsed under bombardment, and the groan of stressed metal echoed like the lament of a fallen brother. I moved with deliberate precision, each step measured, each breath a silent vow to endure where so many had already failed. My bolter's cold grip reminded me of its promise: death for those who would threaten the Imperium. Yet the weapons of man were insufficient here. The universe itself seemed aligned against us, every shadow and shudder conspiring to remind me of my fragility, my mortality. I was a space marine, yes, enhanced beyond the limits of ordinary flesh, yet as I crouched behind a splintered bulkhead, the truth became undeniable. Death was not cheated so easily. From the shadows, a hiss, low and unearthly, betrayed the presence of orc scavengers. Their crude banners fluttered in the smoke, each glyph a mockery of the Imperial Aquila. One lunged forward, massive and stinking, wielding a jagged cleaver with the casual precision of the insane. I raised my bolter, breathing the acrid air through my helm, and fired. The recoil tore through my gauntlets, but the orc fell with a satisfying collapse. Yet in that instant of victory I was reminded that for every enemy felled, another would rise. The manufactorum was alive with them, every corner concealing a threat, every doorway a potential tomb. And still, the silence between attacks was worse than the violence itself, for it allowed the mind to wander into places better left unvisited. I thought of Calvinius, of Valton, of every brother whose presence had been erased in the span of a heartbeat, and I wondered, not for the first time, if this was what the Codex meant by duty, or if it was simply the lie we told ourselves to endure the horror. The first scream came suddenly, tearing through the heavy air like a bolt of lightning. One of the chapter's initiates, panicked and alone, had been caught by a collapsing support beam. The sound was human, raw and unrefined, and it pierced my focus with a cruelty that no enemy could match. I ran to him, bolter ready, but found only the finality of broken bones and the wet sound of life fleeing its vessel. His eyes, wide and uncomprehending beneath the helmet, reflected the chaos outside, and I understood a terrible truth. To survive is not merely to remain breathing, it is to bear the weight of witnessing death without flinching. My own prayers, half-formed and trembling in my throat, were swallowed by the roar of distant ordnance. I dragged the body into the shadowed corner of the chamber, laying him gently despite the grime and blood. In that act I felt the first real tremor of something I had not anticipated. Grief, intimate and searing, tethered inexplicably to duty. Movement at the far end of the hall caught my eye, subtle yet unmistakable. A silhouette, hunched and deliberate, barely visible through the swirling ash. It was a former battle brother, his armor scorched, his sigils defiled. Perhaps a survivor, or perhaps something else entirely. The line between life and corruption blurred here, in the aftermath of bombardment and ritualized slaughter. He raised his hands slowly, and I did the same. Bolter leveled, fingers trembling against the trigger. Recognition flashed in his eyes. Fear mingled with something darker, something unknowable. In the silence, I realized that the battlefield does not merely claim the body. It reaches into the mind, probing the edges of faith, morality, and reason itself. My training screamed a fire to act, to survive, yet some part of me hesitated, caught between the brother I knew and the threat he might now embody. The hesitation was enough. A pulse of energy, green and sickly, lashed across the hall, shattering stone and flesh alike. The brother I had recognized, or thought I had, was gone, leaving only the scent of ozone and the echo of failure. The manufactorum itself seemed to shudder in acknowledgement of this act, metal groaning, dust settling into new shadows. I pressed on, bolter clutched as tightly as my resolve, my mind a battleground as relentless as the one surrounding me. Faith, I realized, was not the absence of fear, but the refusal to surrender to it, even as every instinct begged for reprieve. And in that understanding I found a grim clarity. Survival demanded not only strength, but the willingness to carry the weight of every soul lost alongside you, an unending chain of remembrance, honor, and burden. By the time I reached the inner sanctum of the manufactorum, the horizon beyond the shattered windows burned with the light of artillery and promethium fires. Smoke twisted into unnatural forms, and the distant howl of a battle barge's engines reminded me of the galaxy's indifference to individual struggle. I knelt briefly, wiping the grime and ash from my visor, and let the enormity of the day settle around me. To survive the edge of faith is to understand that every breath is both gift and curse, every heartbeat a defiance of oblivion. And as I rose, bolter in hand, ready to face whatever remained of the enemy, or perhaps the shadows of my own doubts, I knew that the true test had only begun. The inner sanctum offered no sanctuary. The manufactorum's machinery had long since fallen silent, twisted and molten from the relentless orc bombardment, but the echo of its former purpose lingered like a ghost. Pipes hissed, vents groaned, and the scent of scorched fuel clung to every surface. I moved carefully, aware that even here, the battlefield's reach extended, that death did not respect walls or the sanctity of a shelter. My bolter felt unnaturally heavy in my hands, the recoil a reminder of the artificial strength I wielded. Each step I took seemed to draw attention, though perhaps it was only the echo of my own fear magnified by the emptiness around me. I thought of my brothers, Calvinius, Valton, the initiate whose life had ended in my hands, and the weight of their absence settled into my shoulders like a physical burden. Then I heard it. The faint metallic scrape of movement, deliberate and unnatural. My reflexes, honed through years of training and litany, reacted before my mind could catch up. The shadows along the far wall shifted, and a figure emerged, unwillingly or perhaps inexorably, half human, half mangled by war and decay. I recognized the chapter markings, defaced and scorched beyond recognition. Was it a brother, or something the battlefield had reshaped into something else entirely? Fear rose, not just for my life, but for the integrity of my own soul. I tightened my grip on my bolter, voice swallowed beneath my helmet, thoughts racing between prayer, recollection, and the instinct to survive. The figure spoke, a rasping whisper that carried through the empty hall. The words were fractured, prayer twisted by desperation and pain. Emperor, forgive. Forgive me. Each syllable struck like a blade, reminding me that faith can falter under pressure, that the strongest armor cannot shield a mind from guilt. I took a measured step closer, bolter raised and the figure's head drooped, revealing a face I almost recognized beneath the cinder-black soot. Recognition collided with disbelief. A brother lost, yet lingering, changed. A reminder that the battlefield spares nothing and war leaves traces even on the faithful. I lowered my weapon, unsure if mercy or wrath was the greater command of the day, and found that indecision itself was a weapon the galaxy wielded with precision. A sudden explosion rocked the manufactorum, sending sparks raining from broken conduits. Dust and debris filled the air, burning eyes, clogging respirators, but I pressed onward. Survival demanded forward motion. Hesitation would be the enemy's gift. The shadows writhed around me, reflecting the chaos without, the ghosts within, and the distant hollow toll of vox chimes that seemed less a call to duty than a reminder of mortality. Each step became a meditation, each breath a vow. I remembered the lessons drilled into me by my chapter sergeants. Honor is maintained through action, courage is forged in confrontation, and faith is the ember that keeps the mind from being consumed by the void. Yet even as I recited these truths, I knew the battlefield cared nothing for doctrine, nothing for litany, nothing for the fragile constructs that gave us purpose. It only demanded endurance. By the time I reached the upper gallery, Overlooking the shattered expanse of the manufactorum floor, the scale of the loss became almost unbearable. Smoke twisted into grotesque shapes, illuminated by the flickering fires of fallen war machines. Bodies, brothers, orcs, and unknown creatures alike, lay scattered, indistinguishable in their finality. The reality of survival struck me fully. To continue is to witness, to endure, to carry the memory of what has been sacrificed, and to move forward knowing the world offers no consolation. I let my gaze sweep the devastation, committing every detail to memory, each fallen brother's visage a silent oath. And then the distant hum reached me, low and resonant, vibrating through the manufactorum floor, through my armor, through the marrow itself. It was the sound of a dreadnought, ancient and unstoppable, moving toward whatever remained of the enemy, or perhaps toward the survivors it would judge. I felt the edge of faith sharpen within me, a blade forged of fear, honor, and resolve. I would survive. I would endure. Not for glory, not for recognition, but for the quiet, unspoken oath to those who had fallen beside me. And as I adjusted my grip on my bolter and prepared to descend into the chaos below, I understood fully that this was only the beginning. The first test of faith, the first brush with mortality, the first lesson that survival carries a weight heavier than any armor can bear. The manufactorum waited, patient and indifferent. Outside, the sky burned with promethium fires, the distant artillery creating a rhythm that would not stop. Inside, I breathed, and in that breath I swore to the Emperor and to the fallen that I would endure, no matter what lay ahead. The manufactorum behind me lay in ruin, a skeleton of twisted girders and shattered ceramite. The air outside reeked of promethium and burnt flesh, but it was quieter now. Quiet enough that I could hear the subtle rhythm of my own heartbeat beneath the helm. Every sound, from the distant scream of collapsing spires to the low moan of wind through ruined towers, felt magnified, an orchestra of solitude that emphasized my isolation. The brothers were gone, scattered in death or lost to the chaos that swallowed Hive Volantis whole. I had survived, but survival was no reward. It was a sentence. The emptiness around me was not peace. It was a corridor of reflection, a testing ground where the weight of memory and conscience pressed more heavily than any bolter or blade. Each step I took through the ruined hive streets was deliberate, each movement a measure of caution and instinct. Debris crunched beneath ceramite boots, a subtle betrayal of my presence, while the distant echo of orc warbands reverberated like a pulse in the ruins. I saw no life here, not human, not Xenos, not even the faint whisper of servitors whose programming had long since failed. The silence was not serene. It was oppressive, each second stretching into a small eternity, and in it my mind began to wander to darker places. Memories of fallen brothers rose unbidden, their faces twisted in surprise, pain, or unspoken fear. The dead are usually silent, yet here, in the absence of all else, they became a chorus demanding recognition, demanding remembrance. Hunger gnawed at me, not the voracious, animalistic hunger of a mortal, but the quiet reminder that even augmented flesh requires fuel. I found a scorched food cache, rations partially ruined by fire and contamination. It was barely enough to sustain me, but I ate with meticulous care, each bite an act of defiance against the decay surrounding me. The taste of synthetic protein was metallic, bitter, yet necessary, grounding me in a reality that was otherwise unraveling. I thought of the Codex again and wondered bitterly if it accounted for the moments between battle, when a space marine is forced to reckon with solitude, hunger, and the slow erosion of certainty. It did not. As I pressed deeper into the abandoned sector, the shadows lengthened unnaturally, twisted by smoke and the curvature of broken architecture. Every doorway, every corridor could conceal a threat, yet the mind begins to fabricate dangers where none exist. I glimpsed movement, or thought I did. A flicker of something human-shaped, perhaps a survivor, perhaps a trap. My bolter raised. I advanced cautiously, only to find a collapsed bridge, twisted girders forming a labyrinthine blockade that forced me to navigate the ruins in silence. I realized the most dangerous opponent was not Orc, Chaos, or Xenos. It was the self, the mind stretched thin by fear, fatigue, and isolation. The hours, or perhaps days, I could no longer tell, passed in a blur of careful navigation, vigilance, and the unrelenting whisper of my own thoughts. Each sound was magnified. The creak of a support beam, the scuttle of some unseen vermin, the distant echo of artillery bouncing through multiple sectors. I saw no one, yet the feeling of being observed never left. Perhaps it was paranoia, a symptom of exhaustion. Perhaps it was the hive itself, alive in a way the Codex could not account for, feeding off fear, despair, and the whispered prayers of the faithful. I pressed on, each step a negotiation with the unknown, each breath a reminder that survival is both physical and mental. And then I found the first sign of the corrupted. Graffiti scrawled in the blood of unknown victims, symbols that bent geometry and understanding alike. The telltale signs of chaos influence creeping into even the abandoned sectors. The markings were subtle, almost polite in their intrusion, yet impossible to ignore. I traced them with gloved fingers, noting the pattern, the intent, and the unmistakable echo of blasphemy. Fear surged, but I did not hesitate. A space marine does not pause for terror. I pressed forward, each step a testament to willpower over instinct, faith over instinctive panic. In that narrow, smoke-choked corridor, I began to understand that the descent into isolation was not merely physical. It was a journey into the mind, a confrontation with doubt, temptation, and the creeping horror that waits when one stands alone. The deeper I pressed into Hive Volantis, the more the architecture itself seemed to conspire against me. Corridors bent at unnatural angles, walls fractured and leaning as if straining under an invisible weight. My sensors, the mechanical extensions of my own body, picked up vibrations too subtle for mortal perception. The slow tremor of distant Xenos engines, the drip of tainted water pooling in rusted vats, the shifting of debris that threatened to bury the unwary. Each sound forced my muscles to coil, my reflexes to sharpen. The air itself was thick with the taste of rot and chemical corrosion, carrying a faint tang of ozone that suggested lingering energy discharges, perhaps from orc scrap machinery or some unclean warp-touch device left behind. Every step was a negotiation with uncertainty, every breath a measured exercise in endurance. I found signs of previous survivors, or perhaps victims, along the narrow corridors, scorched ceramite shards, the remnants of servitors long abandoned, and the occasional trail of blood that had dried into the texture of the stone floor. Each trace told a story, a fragment of a life ended abruptly, a warning left in absence. The isolation was beginning to burrow beneath my ceramite, filling the spaces between instinct and thought with doubt. Was I truly alone, or had the Hive already claimed others, twisting them into unrecognizable forms, lurking just beyond the edge of perception? Even with the gene-forged resilience of my mind, the subtle gnaw of fear was undeniable. Survival demanded vigilance, yet vigilance demanded energy, and energy was slipping through my fingers like sand. By the time I reached the central reactor hall, the scale of abandonment struck me fully. Machinery that once roared with life now lay dormant, its arteries of conduit and piping cracked and fouled with corrosion. Sparks leapt unpredictably from exposed wires, casting jagged, dancing shadows that played across the walls like the movements of unseen figures. I paused, tracing the familiar shapes of the Emperor's Aquila etched into the supports, reminders that even in decay, devotion could endure, or at least be remembered. I allowed myself a brief pause to assess, to ration my dwindling supply of stim packs, to run diagnostics on my armor and weapon systems. There was no relief in preparation, only the cold arithmetic of survival. Each decision was a matter of life and death, each hesitation a potential lapse with consequences I could not yet measure. Movement in the shadows, sudden and jagged, pulled me from contemplation. Something or someone was here. The hairs along the nape of my neck bristled beneath the helmet, my instincts screaming a warning that reason struggled to interpret. I advanced cautiously, bolter raised, senses straining against the dim, flickering light. The figure emerged from behind a collapsed control console, hunched and jerking unnaturally, features half hidden in soot and corrosion. It was not wholly human, perhaps a survivor, or perhaps something warped by the Hive, by chaos, or by hunger. I did not fire immediately. I could not. Some part of me hesitated at the recognition of kinship, at the faint possibility of a brother, and in that hesitation, I glimpsed the truth of isolation. It does not merely separate the body from comrades, it warps perception, bending doubt and hope into a single, nearly unmanageable force. The figure lurched closer, emitting a soft, rasping whine that resembled both plea and warning. I could see the faint shimmer of corrupted armor, signs of tampering or mutation, marks that suggested something more insidious than mere injury. And yet, within the mangled visage I glimpsed humanity, or what remained of it, a spark of recognition, a memory of training and loyalty. I lowered my bolter slightly, the decision weighing on me like the combined gravitas of every fallen brother. My instincts screamed caution, but some deeper sense shaped by years of indoctrination and honor compelled me to witness rather than immediately strike. Perhaps it was mercy, or perhaps it was curiosity, but whatever it was, it tied me further into the labyrinth of the hive, binding my fate to the unseen forces that waited in the shadows. I pressed onward past the figure, moving deeper into the reactor hall, senses alert, mind sharpened. Every step a negotiation with the creeping terror that isolation breeds. The halls narrowed, the machinery grew more unstable, and the distant echoes of collapse, punctuated by the occasional distant roar of unknown engines, reminded me of the galaxy's indifference. Alone, there is no comfort in doctrine or faith. The mind must create its own anchors, fragmentary and precarious, and cling to them through the relentless assault of fear and fatigue. I understood now that survival was more than evasion or combat. It was endurance of the self, of the mind and the soul, in a galaxy that offers no quarter, no absolution, and no end to the test. The reactor hall opened into a vast chamber, a cathedral of iron and circuitry long abandoned. The air hummed with residual energy, faint but insistent, a vibration that settled into the bones and reminded me that the hive itself was alive, or at least remembered its purpose. Shadows stretched along the walls, elongated by the flickering glow of sparking conduits, creating illusions of movement where there was none, or perhaps movement where I did not dare to trust my own eyes. Each step echoed, a solitary percussion in the vast emptiness, emphasizing the depth of my isolation. No vox chimes, no command, no brother. Just the quiet thrum of the hive and the whisper of my own respirator. I traced the edge of the chamber, careful to avoid unstable flooring, the corroded remnants of machinery threatening to collapse under the weight of ceramite. The once pristine conduits were gouged and scorched, and somewhere in the shadows, I thought I heard the faint hiss of a hydraulic system coming to life. Though it was impossible to know if it was real or imagined, my thoughts circled back to the fallen, to the brothers whose lives had ended in a heartbeat, and I felt the first sting of something I had not expected in all my training: loneliness. The Codex Astartes teaches resilience, courage and duty, but no tome, no sergeant, no ritual prepared me for the oppressive quiet that forces the mind to reckon with its own insignificance. The chamber's far end led to a narrow maintenance tunnel, choked with the detritus of war and decay. I moved into it with care, aware that each constricted step could be my last if miscalculated. The air was thick, every breath tasting of metal and dust, carrying whispers of what had been lost. Somewhere deep beneath the surface, the faint vibration of an active power source suggested the hive's life had not completely abandoned this sector. Perhaps there was hope, or perhaps only danger. But instinct demanded movement, and survival had become the only language I could trust. A distant sound froze me mid-step, the low scrape of claws, or perhaps ceramite against metal, coming from a side shaft. My bolter rose instinctively, and I waited, holding the echo of every prayer, every lesson, every moment of training in my mind. The figure that emerged was small, hunched, grotesque in its resemblance to humanity. It had been a scavenger, a wretch twisted by hunger and desperation, eyes wide with fear and recognition at the sight of my chapter markings. My first instinct was to fire, to eliminate the unknown. And yet in the silence I realized that hesitation itself had become a test, and that the galaxy often punished not action, but the mind's attempt to measure consequence. I advanced past the figure, bolter still ready, senses alert for every whisper, every tremor, every anomaly that might signal attack. The hive's corridors seemed to tighten, the walls closing in with each step, carrying the smell of rot, the tang of chemical corrosion, the faint trace of warp energy that left the hairs on my neck standing. In this isolation, the mind becomes both ally and enemy, shaping shadows into threats, hopes into delusions, and reality into an ever-shifting calculus of fear and necessity. I pressed onward, aware that even in solitude, the hive tests its victims, measuring endurance, faith, and the resilience of spirit. Hours, or perhaps days, passed without a mark on the floor, without a sound beyond my own careful movement and the distant groan of shifting debris. My rations were nearly gone, my stimpaks nearly exhausted, and yet the instinct to survive drove me forward deeper into the hive's bowels. I moved past a chamber that had once been a servitor workshop, now broken, machines shattered and oil-stained, their synthetic operators long since fallen silent. The emptiness was oppressive, yet it taught me a lesson no battle could. Survival is not only about strength, speed, or skill. It is about endurance of the mind, fortitude of the will, and the refusal to surrender, even when all around you insists that nothing remains worth saving. By the time I reached the lower levels, the corridors grew narrower, the darkness more complete. I felt the weight of solitude pressing against ceramite and bone alike, an unyielding force that tested both faith and resolve. Every shadow was a challenge, every step a negotiation with doubt, every breath a reminder that survival is not granted but earned, moment by moment, in the quiet crucible of isolation. And in that crucible, I began to understand a truth that would follow me across every battlefield. Every ruined hive, every shadowed corridor to endure is to carry the memory of the fallen, the weight of one's own conscience, and the recognition that the galaxy is a cruel, indifferent judge, and yet even so, to continue is the only act that matters. The deeper I ventured into the hive, the more reality itself seemed to shift. The walls twisted subtly, shadows bending where logic insisted they could not, and the hum of machinery, or was it something else entirely, filled the void like a slow chant. My ceramite armor, though unyielding, felt increasingly like a cage, each movement amplified, each sound magnified. I realized as I traced the remnants of a scorched passage that the most insidious enemy was no longer orc or traitor. It was perception itself. Isolation had begun to warp my senses, turning whispers into warnings, echoes into conversations, and shadows into figures that flickered at the edge of understanding. Then I saw him. At first I believed it a trick of the light, a phantom conjured by exhaustion and hunger. But the armor bore the unmistakable sigils of our chapter, twisted and desecrated. The figure moved with a predatory grace, each step deliberate, echoing faintly against the ruined walls. It was a brother, or once had been, though the corruption that marred his form made recognition a cruel mockery. Blackened ceramite, etched with symbols I did not understand, glowed faintly with a sickly green radiance that burned the edges of my vision. I raised my bolter, voice silent beneath the helm, and waited for the figure to speak or strike, aware that hesitation could be death, but action might be worse. Brother, his voice was a rasp, distorted by corruption and pain, yet there was a fragment of the man I once knew within it. Recognition collided with horror. My mind struggled to reconcile loyalty with instinct, devotion with the knowledge that this being had embraced, or been forced into, heresy. The Codex speaks of the need to purge corruption, yet the heart recognizes what the mind resists. I saw in his eyes a reflection of my own fear, a mirror that showed not just what I could lose, but what I might become if the galaxy tested me too long, too harshly, alone. The chamber seemed to constrict around us, machinery groaning in protest as if the hive itself anticipated the confrontation. Sparks flickered along the exposed conduits, casting grotesque shadows that writhed in unnatural shapes. The corrupted brother raised a hand slowly, a gesture of both recognition and warning, and I understood that the battlefield had now become as much moral and spiritual as it was physical. Faith, training, and instinct collided, leaving me suspended in a moment where survival required more than bolter fire. It demanded discernment, courage, and the ability to see beyond mere flesh. He advanced then, not with the reckless violence of an orc, but with a measured, deliberate pace, each motion a test. I readied my bolter, muscles coiled, yet hesitation lingered. Was he a threat to life or a caution to the soul? The line between loyalty and heresy blurred, and I felt it thread through my mind like a needle through ceramite, sowing doubt into resolve. The Codex teaches to purge the corrupted without hesitation, yet it cannot account for the hesitation of the heart, the recognition of shared blood, shared battle, shared faith now defiled. A sudden movement caught the corner of my vision, a distortion of space, a ripple along the walls as if the hive itself responded to the presence of warp taint. My sensors flickered, momentarily unreliable as the air thickened with the scent of ozone and decay. Panic threatened to rise, but I forced it down, grounding myself in training and faith. I understood then that to confront heresy is not merely to fire upon the corrupted, but to confront the darkness within oneself. Each hesitation, each measured breath, became a meditation on loyalty, courage, and the weight of command that existence itself demands. In that moment, the heretic brother raised a hand, and the faint glow along his armor intensified. Symbols of chaos, not fully comprehensible, shimmered against the dim light, casting reflections that made the walls seem to breathe. I saw the potential for devastation in his movements, yet within those gestures there remained a trace of the man I once called brother. To strike was necessary, but it carried a cost that resonated far beyond the immediate survival calculus. The battlefield had become a crucible, testing not just strength and skill but faith, moral judgment, and the ability to endure the sight of what could have been. The air thickened as I advanced, each footfall measured, bolter raised and ready, yet tempered by hesitation. The corrupted brother mirrored my movements, his unnatural posture a perverse reflection of my own, the armor beneath him scarred and warped, the sigils of our chapter barely recognizable beneath the burnished filigree of chaos. Every instinct screamed to fire, to purge, to end the abomination before me, and yet something deeper, older, whispered caution. He was once one of us. My mind flicked through memories of shared drills, battle cries, and whispered prayers aboard the strike cruiser before deployment. The recognition was painful, a knife twisting deeper with each recollection. Could loyalty persist beyond corruption? Could faith survive the visible embodiment of its failure? I saw the faint glimmer of hope, or perhaps deception within his eyes. The glow of warp-touch sigils shimmered across the walls, distorting the shadows into impossible shapes. Yet within that distortion lay a mirror, the reflection of my own fears and temptations. To hesitate was dangerous, yet to strike recklessly could be catastrophic. The hive itself seemed aware, resonating with a hum that vibrated through ceramite, bone, and spirit alike. My respirator filtered the acrid air, but it could not filter the knowledge that the galaxy's trials were not only external, they were internal. Survival demanded clarity, and clarity demanded a confrontation not with the enemy, but with the self. He advanced slowly, deliberately, each movement choreographed with a perverse intelligence. The further he came, the more I felt the tug of memory against duty, recognition against instinct, brotherhood against the necessity of purging corruption. My bolter felt heavier in my hands, each shot a potential act of mercy or damnation. I forced my thoughts to focus, tracing the contours of his form, counting the telltale signs of mutation, the unnatural glow beneath the ceramite plates. There was power here, yes, warp-tainted energy that could twist flesh and mind. But there was also hesitation, a human trace within the monstrous exterior. I realized that to survive, I must confront both threats simultaneously, the physical danger and the moral weight of its presence. A sudden hiss, subtle but unmistakable, drew my attention to the chamber's far corner. Shadow shifted unnaturally, as if something unseen watched our standoff, its intent unreadable. Was it a demon, a remnant of the hive's warp taint, or merely the echo of my own mind, fractured by isolation and fatigue? The question was irrelevant. The answer could wait. The immediate danger was before me, a mirror reflecting not only what I faced, but what I might become under the pressure of fear and temptation. My grip tightened on the bolter, muscles coiled for action, yet my mind traced the path of least compromise, to endure without sacrificing the integrity of faith or the fragment of humanity I still possessed. He raised a hand, and I saw the faint shimmer of warp energy crest along his fingertips. The air distorted, a subtle vibration that tugged at the edges of perception, bending shadows and thought alike. I felt the pull, the temptation to falter, to strike blindly, to let instinct alone dictate action. But I did not. I remembered the words whispered in prayer, the lessons drilled in endless repetition. The Emperor's light may falter in the galaxy, but it must endure within those who bear his name. My faith became armor, my resolve sharpened into a blade as precise as any weapon. I advanced step by deliberate step, each motion a testament to willpower over fear, to devotion over instinct, to survival without surrendering the soul. The chamber seemed to pulse with tension, a heartbeat that was not mine alone. I realized the standoff was more than a duel. It was a crucible, testing the limits of loyalty, courage, and spiritual fortitude. One wrong movement, one snap judgment could end both our lives, or worse, destroy what remained of the man beneath the corruption. And yet, as I closed the distance, I felt something unexpected. A faint echo of recognition, a resonance of shared history that reminded me why we fight, why we endure, why the edge of faith is not defined by victory alone, but by the strength to confront darkness in all its forms, external and internal alike. The corrupted brother hesitated, and in that pause, I glimpsed the fractured remnants of the man he had been. Memories surged unbidden. His laughter during training drills, the quiet devotion at the chapel, the certainty in his voice when reciting the litany of duty. And yet, standing before me now, he was a vessel of something alien, touched by forces that mocked our faith and distorted purpose. My bolter felt impossibly heavy in my hands, its weight compounded not by steel alone, but by the moral calculus pressing against my mind. Each breath, each heartbeat, became a negotiation with despair and duty alike. A subtle movement, too deliberate to be random, brought him closer. His gaze locked with mine, and I saw in it both defiance and the faintest glimmer of recognition. The chamber's shadows writhed around him, illuminated by sparks from scorched conduits, and for a moment, the world seemed to tilt. The hive itself held its breath. I realized then that the confrontation was not merely physical. It was spiritual, psychological, a battle fought in the spaces between thought and instinct. To strike without discernment would be to dishonor both the fallen and the living. To hesitate too long risked annihilation. Survival, I understood, demanded not just action but precision, and faith demanded clarity where clarity was nearly impossible to find. Then came the hiss of energy, faint but insistent, and the green glow along his armor flared as though responding to my presence. He raised both hands slowly, the sigils of chaos pulsing like a heartbeat, casting grotesque reflections across the chamber. I braced myself, every muscle taut, every thought focused on control, on discipline, on the remembrance of the Emperor's will. Yet in the quiet beneath the crackle of sparks, I felt the first whisper of empathy, the recognition that even in corruption, fragments of what had been loyal, faithful, and human remained. And in that recognition lay both danger and revelation. The enemy was not simply outside. It was within, mirrored in the choices I faced, reflected in the doubt that pressed against my resolve. A sudden surge of movement forced me into action. He lunged and instinct took over. Bolter fire roared, the recoil driving back through gauntlets and shoulders, and the chamber shook with the impact. Sparks flared where the rounds struck his corrupted armor, carving fissures that glowed with the sickly light of warp-touched corruption. He faltered, stumbled, yet his eyes never left mine. And in that glance I saw more than defiance. I saw the question of survival itself. What is the cost of enduring? The floor beneath us groaned, metal twisted, and I realized the battleground was both corporeal and metaphysical, a place where action and consequence were inseparable, and where every choice resonated beyond the immediate. I advanced again. Bolter raised, movements precise and deliberate, each step an assertion of will over instinct, duty over fear. The corrupted brother mirrored me still, yet with every motion I saw the line between who he had been and what he had become. I did not falter, though the echo of his former presence weighed heavily, a specter pressing against the edge of my own faith. The hive seemed to pulse with the rhythm of confrontation, machinery moaning, sparks cascading like fireflies caught in invisible currents, the shadows writhing in recognition of the tension that had grown beyond simple combat. Finally, the space between us shrank to a breath, a heartbeat. I saw every imperfection in his corrupted armor, every jagged edge and warped sigil, and understood that survival demanded both judgment and restraint. To endure was not merely to remain standing, but to carry the memory, the conscience, and the lessons of those who had fallen beside me. I hesitated. Bolter raised, and the chamber held its silence, waiting for the first act to define the rest. The heretic's mirror reflected not just his corruption, but the fragile thread of my own humanity, and in that reflection, I knew that the next movement would shape more than the outcome of this encounter. It would shape the very understanding of what it meant to survive in a galaxy that offers no forgiveness, no respite, and no certainty. The chamber seemed to breathe, its shadows curling around us like living things, the residual hum of the hive vibrating through the floor, through my armor, into bone and marrow. The corrupted brother lingered a heartbeat away, each motion deliberate, a mockery of the disciplined grace I had trained to embody. The green glow along his armor flared intermittently, reflecting off the jagged remnants of the manufactorum ceiling, and in that sickly light, I could see the truth of war writ in the distortion of flesh and ceramite. Victory is never pure, and survival exacts a toll beyond what the mind anticipates. I raised my bolter slowly, not in hesitation, but in understanding. Each bolt I could fire carried consequence beyond the immediate. It might strike a threat, or it might destroy a fragment of what had once been a brother. I realized then that the battlefield was not simply physical space. It was moral, spiritual, a testing ground where faith, memory, and instinct collided with lethal efficiency. The hive itself seemed aware, resonating with the tension, acknowledging the standoff, bearing witness to the choices that would define not just survival, but the preservation of honor in the face of corruption. A flicker of movement caught my eye, a subtle, almost imperceptible twitch in his posture, and I acted. Bolter fire tore through the space between us, rounds striking the warped ceramite with thunderous impact. Sparks flew, the green glow flaring violently before dimming, but the figure did not fall completely. He stumbled, staggered, and yet his gaze remained fixed upon me, unyielding, a mirror of determination, pain, and memory. In that moment, the battlefield ceased to be merely walls and debris. It became a crucible, a place where loyalty and survival, faith and instinct were weighed with invisible scales, and where each choice would leave a mark not on the enemy alone, but upon my own soul. He lunged again, claws or gauntleted fists smashing toward my chest, and I met him with precision, striking with the butt of my bolter. Parrying with gauntleted strength honed through centuries of training, sparks flew where ceramite met corrupted steel, and the chamber groaned in protest. Pain lanced through my side from the impact, but I did not falter. Survival demanded endurance, and faith demanded clarity, even when every instinct screamed to strike blindly or to yield. The standoff stretched into moments that felt like hours, the weight of isolation pressing upon me, reminding me that to endure is more than surviving physical threat. It is to withstand the reflection of what one could become, and what the galaxy might demand in moments of moral ambiguity. The corrupted brother faltered, a misstep revealing vulnerability. I saw the opportunity to end it, to purge the threat decisively. Yet even as my finger tightened on the trigger, I felt the echo of what had been lost. The presence of the man behind the corruption, and the weight of every oath sworn to the Emperor. To strike recklessly would be survival alone. To pause, even a heartbeat longer, was recognition, remembrance, and the preservation of honor in a galaxy that often allows neither. I took the moment, measured and deliberate, and adjusted my stance, ensuring readiness for the inevitable, but holding the integrity of judgment intact. The chamber's machinery, long dormant, reacted suddenly to the standoff. Sparks arced along damaged conduits, dislodging panels and sending the green glow flickering wildly across the walls. Dust and ozone filled the air, and the hive seemed to lean into the tension, amplifying the psychological weight of isolation and confrontation. I realized then that this moment was not merely about survival, nor the elimination of an enemy. It was a lesson, brutal and unflinching, that the edge of faith is measured not by action alone, but by restraint, perception, and the capacity to endure without succumbing to the corruption of instinct, fear, or despair. And in that awareness I found clarity. The corrupted figure, for all his warping and heresy, was a mirror, not just of what could befall a brother in the hive, but of the trial I faced within myself. Survival demanded more than firepower. It demanded vigilance, discernment, and the courage to endure, even when the world, the hive, and the reflection before me insisted otherwise. Bolter ready, senses sharp, faith tempered. I prepared for what came next, not with blind fury but with measured resolve, knowing that every choice would echo beyond this chamber, beyond this battle, and into the essence of what it meant to remain human, loyal, and alive amidst the horror of war. Emerging from the hive's deepest corridors, the battlefield stretched before me in a panorama of ruin. The cityscape of Hive Volantis had been carved into grotesque silhouettes by fire and promethium flare. Towers fractured, spires toppled, and manufactorums left as skeletal remnants of industry. The wind carried the bitter tang of smoke and ozone, whispering across the rubble with a voice that seemed almost sentient. I realized with a cold clarity that survival had not merely carried me through physical threats, it had placed me at the edge of perception, in where the galaxy's indifference becomes an undeniable weight pressing against flesh and spirit alike. The isolation of the hive had sharpened my awareness, yet now, beyond its bowels, the broader horror unfolded. The Imperium itself was fractured, evident not in theory but in visible scars. Banners of once loyal regiments torn or defiled. Skitarii units halted mid-patrol with systems partially failing, and distant Vox signals scrambled with warnings of incursions from Orc warbands, chaos cults, and the ever-watchful presence of traitor elements. Even the distant glow of an Imperial Navy vessel, visible over the horizon, seemed a fragile promise rather than a guarantee of salvation. Survival was no longer about personal endurance. It was about witnessing the fractures of the Imperium writ across space and matter alike. As I moved across the devastated avenues, the cries of the dying, faint but unceasing, threaded through the smoke. Each sound was a reminder of the Imperium's fragility, the cost of failure, and the relentless pressure of war. I caught sight of a small squad of surviving guardsmen, their lasguns trembling in unsteady hands, eyes wide with disbelief. Their loyalty was intact, but their morale had fractured under the weight of loss. I moved past them silently, bolter at the ready, my presence both a reassurance and a warning. The galaxy offers no aid to those who falter, and I understood that the Imperium's strength is as fragile as the courage of the living, contingent upon the endurance of those who refuse to break. Through the haze of smoke and ruin, I caught sight of the distant Cathedral of Volantis, its spire shattered, its golden icons marred by fire and desecration. The structure once symbolized the unyielding power of faith, the will of the Emperor rendered in stone and sacred ceramite, yet now it leaned precariously, as though acknowledging its own fragility. I climbed debris-strewn steps to gain vantage over the surrounding sector, the wind whipping around my armor with enough force to unsettle even enhanced ceramite joints. From this perch I could see the scale of devastation, factories abandoned, battlefields strewn with corpses, and distant plumes of smoke marking the continued struggles of those who survived. As I surveyed the fractured Imperium, the notion of rumor and perception entered my mind. Whispered through Vox channels, muttered among survivors, were hints that the Emperor's reach had diminished, not in power, but in perception. The Astronomican's light flickered in distant sectors, faint and unreliable, and stories emerged of fragments of Imperial authority, acting independently, sometimes with mercy, sometimes with unintentional cruelty. I considered these reports cautiously, aware that the mind, stressed by isolation and exposure, could twist facts into legend. Yet even rumor carries weight in a galaxy governed by faith as much as by law, and the idea that the Imperium's unity was fragile struck a chord that resonated deeper than any battlefield wound. Moving further into the city, I encountered pockets of resistance and despair, juxtaposed in harsh relief. Loyalist squads fought with courage untempered by hope, their bolters roaring defiance against orc and heretic alike. Nearby, an abandoned outpost held the twisted remains of chaos cultists, their sigils smeared across walls in desperate defiance, each symbol a reminder that the Imperium's enemies are as ideological as they are physical. I realized then that survival in this fractured Imperium demanded not only martial skill, but the capacity to navigate shifting loyalties, to endure moral ambiguity, and to maintain faith in the Emperor's vision, even when the galaxy offers no clear proof that it exists. The sun, or what passed for it behind the smoke-choked skies, dipped low, casting long, grotesque shadows across the city. I paused to catch my breath, bolter lowered briefly, and allowed myself a fleeting moment of reflection. To survive the hive was one ordeal. To endure the fractured Imperium was another entirely. The galaxy stretched before me, indifferent, vast, and cruel. Yet still my path continued forward. The weight of duty, memory, and expectation pressed upon me as heavily as ceramite or bolter recoil, and I understood fully that the trials of survival were intertwined with the trials of conscience. Night descended unevenly across Hive Volantis, the smoke-choked sky blotting out stars and leaving only a dim, flickering horizon where promethium fires still burned. The city was a skeleton of its former self, jagged spires piercing the haze, and I moved through it like a shadow among shadows, bolter at the ready, senses taut. Each step echoed against fractured walls, each breath carried the taste of ash and ozone, and every corner could conceal a threat, orc, heretic, or worse. A fragment of the Imperium's own failures, twisted into deadly form. Survival demanded constant vigilance, yet even vigilance could not guard against the corrosion of hope. I encountered the first evidence of a fractured command structure in the lower sectors. A squad of Skitarii, their augmented forms partially functional, movements jerky and uncoordinated. Their cognition engines flickered in irregular patterns, and their data slates displayed garbled orders. I moved past them silently, aware that their failure was not personal but systemic. The Imperium's vast machinery falters when leadership fractures, and even the most loyal servants become shadows of their potential. My own faith in the Emperor, while steadfast, felt the weight of these failures, pressing against the edge of endurance, reminding me that the galaxy's cruelty is measured not just in enemy fire, but in the slow, unrelenting decay of order. The streets opened into a ruined plaza, once the hub of manufacturum transport and commerce. Rusted servitor chassis lay scattered, their programming irretrievably lost. Limbs twisted grotesquely by collapse or detonation. Smoke rose in spiraling columns, the flickering light of distant fires casting long dancing shadows. In this desolation, The evidence of survival and failure existed side by side. Pockets of loyalist defenders huddled in abandoned shelters, scavenging what little could sustain them, while traces of chaos influence crept along the edges of the square, sigils carved in blood and corrosion. I walked carefully, bolter raised, aware that every step through these ruins was both a test of skill and a meditation on the fragility of the Imperium itself. From the upper levels of a collapsed cathedral, a distant Vox signal carried faintly on static, fragmented orders, repeated requests for reinforcements, and the ever-present echo of bureaucracy struggling against entropy. Even in the ruins, the machinery of the Imperium persisted, a stubborn refusal to surrender despite overwhelming loss. I paused to listen, letting the Vox echoes ripple through my helmet speakers, and reflected on the juxtaposition of endurance and futility. The Imperium survives because of such persistence, yet the cost is measured not in victories alone, but in every life sacrificed, every soul tested, and every fragment of order that cracks under relentless pressure. Moving deeper into the sector, I encountered a cluster of civilian survivors, their faces pale with terror, their limbs marked with burns or wounds left untreated. Fear was etched into every line, a mirror to the broader fractures in Imperial society itself. They looked at me with a mixture of awe, hope, and suspicion, unsure if I was savior, executioner, or merely another ghost passing through their shattered lives. I offered no words. What solace could a single space marine provide amid a city undone by war, betrayal, and neglect? I only ensured my presence was protective, my movements deliberate, and my bolter ready. The Imperium survives in such moments not through rhetoric, but through the silent endurance of its champions, who move through chaos with purpose, even when the galaxy seems to demand surrender. As I climbed the debris-littered steps toward the upper sectors, the scope of devastation became clearer. Factories lay in ruin, banners of fallen regiments fluttered in the wind like tattered prayers, and the distant skyline was punctuated by fires that would burn long into the night. I realized that the fractured Imperium is not only a battlefield of enemies, but of perception, faith, and the slow erosion of hope. Every act of survival, every measured step, and every choice to endure was a bulwark against the collapse, not only of flesh, but of order, loyalty, and belief. The galaxy is indifferent, but it is the persistence of those who refuse to yield that gives it shape, however tenuous. Ascending to the upper levels of High Volantis, the full scale of the Imperium's fracture came into focus. Spires and bridges once bustling with the rhythm of industry now leaned like fractured teeth, each shadow concealing danger or despair. I moved with deliberate caution, bolter raised, every step a negotiation with debris, with instinct, and with the echoes of battles long past. Smoke clung to the air in thick, suffocating swirls, carrying the acrid tang of promethium and the faint metallic undertone of blood. The city had become both battlefield and mausoleum, and every corner bore witness to survival and failure intertwined. In the distance, I glimpsed a patrol of chaos cultists moving with mechanical precision through the ruins. Their forms twisted by mutation and devotion alike, they marked the growing instability of the Imperium's authority, exploiting fractured command and scattered survivors to spread terror and influence. My bolter finger itched, yet I did not fire immediately. Observation was survival. A space marine endures before striking, weighing every decision against consequence and duty. The fractured Imperium demanded more than brute force. It demanded calculation, patience, and the recognition that every action has ramifications far beyond the immediate moment. As I moved through the skeletal remains of a manufactorum plaza, the scale of human suffering became undeniable. Scattered bodies of guardsmen and civilians alike bore witness to indiscriminate destruction, while distant vox chimes carried fragmented pleas for aid or instruction. The Imperium, vast as it is, cannot shield all its subjects simultaneously, and the fractures of command revealed themselves not in theoretical weakness, but in tangible, painful loss. Each echo of suffering reinforced the weight of responsibility that falls upon those who endure. The living bear the legacy of the dead. The survivor upholds the memory and duty of those who cannot. The wind shifted, carrying with it an acrid stench of corruption, a reminder that chaos never rests, never forgets, and never tires in its slow encroachment upon the Imperium. Signs of warp taint marred walls and streets, subtle distortions at first glance, then unmistakable patterns that set even augmented senses on edge. The fractured Imperium is not only defined by broken infrastructure or shattered command, it is also shaped by the insidious pressure of unseen forces, those that test faith, will, and the endurance of the mind. I pressed onward, aware that my presence here was both shield and sentinel, navigating a landscape where loyalty is fragile and survival is contingent upon vigilance, discipline, and the refusal to succumb to despair. I reached a vantage point overlooking the central sector of the hive, a jagged horizon of ruin stretching into the distance. Fires burned unchecked in pockets, and the faint hum of distant artillery marked ongoing conflict. I considered the path forward, noting that the fractured Imperium could not rely on any single bastion of defense. Each surviving element, whether Space Marines, Skitarii, or beleaguered guardsmen, was a note of resilience in a web stretched thin by chaos, war, and indifference. The galaxy offers no mercy, no guarantee, and no reset. Endurance is measured in the accumulation of small, deliberate acts that maintain order against entropy. The full weight of the Imperium's fragility pressed down like the ash-choked sky. The fractured city was not merely a theater of war, but a reflection of the broader reality. Command, faith, and society itself are tenuous constructs, vulnerable to the relentless forces of entropy, heresy, and indifference. Yet even in the face of this, the spark of perseverance remained. Small, fragile, but unyielding. I understood then that survival is not merely personal. It is entwined with the endurance of those who rely on courage, discipline, and loyalty to bear the Imperium's banner through darkness. To endure here is to confront not only enemies, but the cracks in the very edifice of loyalty and belief, and to emerge carrying both memory and duty as a weapon against collapse. From my vantage, the hive stretched like a labyrinthine wound across the planet's surface, each scar a testament to the Imperium's tenuous hold and the galaxy's relentless cruelty. Fires flared along broken manufactorums, their orange tongues licking the blackened walls, while distant silhouettes hinted at both allies and enemies moving within the chaos. Every shadow was a potential threat. Every flicker of movement demanded assessment. The fractured Imperium was no longer a concept or rumor. It was a living, breathing environment, and survival meant reading its patterns as precisely as any tactical map. I descended carefully into a shattered avenue, the remains of once proud regimental banners fluttering weakly in the acrid wind. Ghostly echoes of the past lingered, vox echoes of commanders long gone, the faint hiss of machinery that refused to die, and the occasional desperate plea from civilians who clung to life among the wreckage. I moved past them with measured attention, offering presence without interference, my bolter a silent promise of protection. The Imperium survives not only through the will of its leaders, but through those willing to bear witness, to endure the fractures and to act when survival depends on resolve rather than circumstance. Through the twisted streets, I encountered signs of chaos influence, subtle yet undeniable. Symbols carved into walls, faint glimmers of warp energy, and traces of mutation in scavenger creatures reminded me that the Imperium's fracture is both external and internal. Its enemies exploit doubt and disorder, and the galaxy punishes hesitation as swiftly as it punishes failure. I felt the weight of duty heavier than ever. To survive is not merely to endure personally, but to act as a fulcrum upon which loyalty, faith, and order balance against chaos. The hive, with all its shadows and echoes, became both classroom and crucible, testing not only skill but conscience and resolve. In a ruined plaza, I observed a squad of surviving guardsmen attempting to regroup. Their formations disordered, morale frayed. I moved among them with silent assurance, correcting their lines with gestures and the authority of presence rather than voice. They looked to me as a symbol, a reminder that the Imperium is not just an edifice of stone, ceramite, or bureaucracy, but a living structure sustained by the courage of those willing to endure where others falter. Even as I directed them silently, I recognized the cruel truth. The fractures in the Imperium are not always repaired by firepower alone, but by the endurance of those who refuse to yield, who stand as unbroken nodes in a galaxy otherwise indifferent. The upper sectors loomed ahead, a tangle of ruined spires, collapsed walkways, and scorched manufactorums. I advanced toward them, acutely aware that each step carried potential engagement, each shadow a test of both courage and judgment. I paused briefly, surveying the landscape for signs of greater threats. Orc marauders moving in disorganized swarms, distant chaos cultists sowing disorder, and the faint hum of war machines yet active, their allegiance uncertain. Survival in the fractured Imperium demanded vigilance and adaptability, a recognition that the galaxy punishes overconfidence and rewards measured action. Every observation, every choice, became part of the calculus of endurance. As the last rays of light waned beneath the smoke-choked sky, I understood that the fractured Imperium was both battleground and mirror. It reflected not only the external threats that assailed humanity, but the internal fragility of order, command, and faith. To endure here is to confront both the visible enemy and the unseen erosion of morale, belief, and unity. And as I moved deeper into the upper sectors, I felt the weight of the galaxy settle upon my shoulders. Survival demands more than skill, courage, or bolter fire. It demands the steadfast endurance of spirit, the refusal to surrender hope or discipline, and the capacity to bear witness to fractures without succumbing to them. In the fractured Imperium, every step forward is both triumph and trial, and every act of endurance becomes a thread in the tenuous fabric that still holds humanity together. The upper levels of Hive Volantis faded into a twilight of ash and muted firelight, and I felt the weight of the galaxy pressing down as never before. Shadows clung to ceramite and stone alike, twisted by the smoke-choked air into grotesque silhouettes that seemed to breathe and watch. Survival had carried me through the Hive's bowels, through isolation and confrontation. But here, in the remnants of the upper city, I sensed something more profound, the presence of the Emperor's shadow, not as a guarantee of salvation, but as an unseen measure against which every action, every choice, and every breath was weighed. The Cathedral of Volantis loomed ahead, partially collapsed yet unbowed, its golden icons marred by fire but still glinting faintly against the smoke. I climbed the debris-strewn steps, each movement deliberate, the ceramite of my armor creaking faintly as I adjusted balance against the uneven surface. From this height, the fractured Imperium stretched before me in a panorama of ruin. Twisted manufactorums, crumbling spires, and distant fires that marked both ongoing conflict and the relentless persistence of the galaxy's chaos. The Emperor's shadow was here, not as light or warmth but as a judgment, a constant reminder that survival alone does not suffice. It must be measured against loyalty, faith, and the unyielding standard of duty. I paused at the threshold of the cathedral, the air thick with smoke, ozone, and the faint tang of ancient incense long extinguished. The golden aquila above the entrance glinted faintly, a symbol both of inspiration and unattainable perfection. I reflected on what survival had demanded of me: endurance, vigilance, restraint, and moral clarity. And now, standing at the precipice of this sacred ground, I realized that survival was no longer a measure of physical resilience alone. The galaxy demands more: the fortitude to carry conscience and faith intact through the fires of corruption, betrayal, and relentless violence. A faint, almost imperceptible vibration ran through the floor, resonating through ceramite and bone alike. Somewhere deep within the cathedral, machinery stirred. Remnants of ancient defense systems, automated servitors long abandoned yet still active in a semblance of purpose. I advanced cautiously, bolter raised, every movement calibrated to confront both danger and reverence. The Emperor's shadow, I understood, was not a physical entity here, nor a guaranteed intervention, but a metaphysical presence, a weight pressing upon the choices of all who endure. Even fragments of command, echoes of authority, and whispers of faith carried his influence, shaping action without guarantee, inspiring vigilance without certainty. Through the nave, I saw evidence of both devotion and corruption. Burned vestments lay scattered alongside defaced icons, a testament to the duality of faith in the Imperium. Unyielding loyalty challenged by the persistent threat of chaos. I stepped carefully among the ruins, each creaking beam or displaced block of stone, a reminder that even the most sacred structures are vulnerable, and that endurance is not merely about standing against external threats, but against the slow erosion of belief, morality, and order itself. The cathedral seemed alive in its silence, a subtle hum vibrating through the floor, through my armor and into my very consciousness, echoing the weight of judgment and expectation. A distant whisper carried faintly, almost imperceptible beneath the din of fire and smoke, the remnant of a litany or prayer long lost. I could not be certain whether it was a fragment of the warp, a residual echo from a servitor, or the instinctive projection of my own mind, shaped by fatigue, hunger, and the burden of survival. Yet the effect was undeniable. It reminded me that the Emperor's shadow is not absolute, nor is it tangible. It exists as a measure, a standard, and a trial. Every decision, every moment of endurance, becomes a testament to the persistence of faith and conscience amid the indifferent vastness of the galaxy. The nave stretched before me, vast and scarred, each pillar a fractured testament to centuries of devotion and the relentless passage of war. Shadows clung to the broken stone like living specters, and the faint hum of machinery echoed through the high vaults. I advanced cautiously, bolter raised, aware that the cathedral was not simply a ruin. It was a crucible of perception and faith, a place where survival demanded more than instinct, more than reflex. Here, endurance was measured against moral weight in the unyielding gaze of the Emperor's shadow, unseen yet present in every step. Fragments of servitors, long abandoned and scorched by fire, littered the floor, their mechanical limbs frozen mid-motion, eyes dark and empty. Some still hummed faintly, as if performing ancient rituals, their programming persisting beyond reason or command. The juxtaposition of decay and purpose struck me deeply. The Imperium survives not merely through the strength of the living, but through the persistence of all that endures, whether flesh, ceramite, or servitor. Even in ruin, the Emperor's shadow lingered in these echoes, a measure of perseverance that no fire, blade, or warp corruption could erase. From the far end of the nave, a movement caught my eye, a silhouette against the flickering light of distant fires. At first I thought it a ghost, the projection of fatigue and stress pressing against the edges of perception. But as I advanced, bolter raised and senses taut, the form resolved into something undeniably corporeal. A lone figure, armored in black ceramite etched with faint faded chapter sigils. The armor bore the scars of battle and the figure moved with a measured grace, bolter at the ready, each step deliberate. Recognition struck like a blow. Another space marine, or what remained of one, yet altered by circumstance and the pressures of a galaxy that punishes hesitation with blood and loss. The figure did not speak, nor did I. We circled each other in the nave like predators aware of the stakes, the silence broken only by the faint groan of the cathedral and the distant roar of ongoing conflict outside. I noted the subtle irregularities in their gait, the way shadows warped around them unnaturally, and the faint glint of something alien along their armor. Signs that the pressures of survival and exposure to the galaxy's horrors had left their mark. And yet, in their eyes, or the faint glimmer beneath their helmet, I saw what had survived. Focus, determination, and a measure of faith that mirrored my own. Here was the crucible complete. Survival not only against enemies, but against despair, corruption, and the erosion of loyalty. We advanced cautiously, circling the center of the nave, aware that the cathedral's ruins could conceal both threat and salvation. Sparks from collapsed conduits arced intermittently, illuminating the space with brief flashes that revealed mosaics of ruin and scarred stone. The figure's bolter barrel caught the light, a subtle reflection that marked both weapon and measure of readiness. I understood fully that this encounter was less about immediate combat and more about endurance, an assessment of who we were, what we had endured, and whether the Emperor's shadow remained a guiding standard or a silent, indifferent judge. A faint vibration ran through the floor as we circled, subtle but insistent, like the heartbeat of the cathedral itself. My armor sensors picked up irregularities in the hum, faint energy signatures that suggested residual warp taint or lingering mechanized systems. An environment alive with the consequences of neglect, battle and the galaxy's ceaseless entropy. Survival demanded vigilance, yes, but also reflection. To endure here was to confront not only external threats, but the intangible measures of faith, duty, and resilience, each one reflected back in the eyes of another warrior who had survived the same trials, and each one weighted by the silent judgment of the Emperor's shadow. The figure paused, and in that moment of stillness, I felt the nexus of all I had endured converge. The hive, the heretic's mirror, the fractured Imperium, and now this cathedral, a place where survival intersected with faith, perception, and moral clarity. Every battle fought, every step endured, every hesitation and decision led to this convergence. Here, beneath the ruined vaults and the flickering shadows, I understood that survival is not merely a measure of physical endurance. It is the capacity to endure with conscience, with purpose, and with the persistence of belief, even in a galaxy that offers neither mercy nor certainty. The cathedral's vaults groaned under the weight of centuries, and the faint scent of burnt incense mixed with ozone and the iron tang of blood. The figure remained still across the nave, an unspoken challenge and a reflection of my own endurance. We measured each other in silence, aware that this confrontation was more than the collision of ceramite and bolter. It was a crucible of loyalty, faith, and the stubborn persistence of the human spirit against the galaxy's relentless indifference. Survival had brought me here, but now understanding and judgment demanded the next step. A distant tremor rattled the stone beneath my feet, dust falling from the vaulted ceiling in tiny showers that caught the flickering firelight. Somewhere, far beyond the cathedral, artillery fire echoed, muffled by layers of masonry yet resonant enough to remind me that the galaxy did not pause for reflection. The figure shifted subtly, a slight adjustment in stance that betrayed awareness, anticipation, and the same measure of vigilance that had carried me through the hive, the heretic's mirror, and the fractured streets of Volantis. The Emperor's shadow, intangible yet omnipresent, seemed to press against my spine, a reminder that survival without purpose is hollow, and that endurance is meaningful only when tempered by conscience. I advanced slowly, each step deliberate, bolter raised and ready, yet my mind traced the weight of the encounter. The figure mirrored me, a motion both natural and deliberate, as if our paths were choreographed by the invisible hand of fate and circumstance. Here, in this ruined cathedral, the galaxy's cruelty was distilled. The walls bore witness, the shadows judged, and even the air seemed charged with expectation. Survival demanded more than combat skill. It demanded the ability to navigate the intersection of action and morality, to endure without yielding to the corrosion of instinct or despair. A sudden shift, a faint flicker of movement beneath the other figure's helm, caused a pulse of tension to surge through my ceramite. The figure raised their bolter yet did not fire. I realized then that this encounter was not meant to be concluded by violence, at least not immediately. It was a test of judgment, a mirror reflecting the trials of survival, faith, and purpose. We were both survivors, yet the galaxy's indifference had shaped us differently, leaving scars in flesh, ceramite, and conscience. The cathedral, fractured and scarred, became a sanctuary of revelation. Endurance is not merely to live, but to persist with clarity of mind and steadfastness of soul. The echo of footsteps, distant yet precise, suggested that the hive's periphery remained active with movement. Both ally and enemy alike, my senses, sharpened by centuries of training, detected subtle shifts in air currents, vibrations along stone and metal, and faint traces of warp taint lingering in corners where fire had consumed the previous structure. Even amidst ruin, vigilance was necessary. Survival demanded awareness, adaptability, and the capacity to act decisively when the galaxy's threats manifested. The fractured Imperium had prepared me for this in part, but the cathedral imposed a higher trial, a judgment of endurance beyond physical skill, testing faith, perception, and the moral fiber of a space marine's soul. I stepped closer, allowing the space between us to collapse into tension rather than distance. In that moment, the cathedral seemed to pulse with energy, not warp, not fire, but a resonance that mirrored my own resolve. The figure remained still, yet the weight of potential action was palpable. I understood fully that survival here is intertwined with moral clarity, the recognition that endurance requires both action and restraint, and that the Emperor's shadow is not merely a beacon, but a standard against which all choices are weighed. Each breath, each movement became a litmus of loyalty and faith, a test that extended beyond the battlefield to the essence of being itself. And in that stillness, as shadows danced across the fractured iconography, and the hum of distant fires reverberated through stone and ceramite, I understood the galaxy offers no absolutes, no guarantees of victory or reprieve. Survival is not measured by triumph over enemies alone, but by the capacity to endure, to act with purpose, and to carry conscience and faith unbroken through a galaxy that relentlessly seeks to erode them. The Emperor's shadow was not a presence to be seen or touched, but a weight to be felt, a standard to endure beneath, and a reminder that even in the vast, uncaring void, persistence with clarity is the truest form of survival. The figure remained across the nave, still silent, a living reflection of the trials I had endured. Every scar on their ceramite, every dent and abrasion told a story of survival, of battles fought and conscience tested, mirroring my own journey through Hive Volantis. In that stillness, the cathedral seemed to hold its breath, the distant echoes of fire and artillery fading into a muted, reverent silence that pressed against ceramite and flesh alike. The Emperor's shadow was not light here. It was weight, a standard of endurance and moral clarity that demanded recognition, not deference. I advanced, the space between us shrinking, each step deliberate, measured. The hum of ancient machinery thrummed beneath the floor, and I could feel the subtle vibrations in my boots and armor, a reminder that even abandoned structures retain the echoes of purpose. The figure mirrored my movements, and I realized that survival in this fractured Imperium was no longer merely a question of combat skill or reflex. It was a meditation, a test of judgment and restraint, a balance between action and observation, where every choice resonated beyond the immediate and left a mark on conscience as well as ceramite. In the distance, the upper spires of the hive flickered with the light of distant fires, faint glows that suggested ongoing conflict, ongoing survival, and ongoing collapse. The Imperium, vast and fractured, persisted in fragments, regiments isolated, manufactorums compromised, Skitarii units partially functional, and civilians clinging to life in pockets of ruin. Yet amid this chaos, the endurance of the faithful, the vigilant, and the disciplined remained. Each of us, a solitary node of resistance, measured not only by survival but by the capacity to persist with clarity, purpose, and conscience. The Emperor's shadow is carried in these moments, intangible but undeniable, shaping the actions of those who still walk the shattered streets. The figure shifted subtly, a tilt of the head, an almost imperceptible adjustment of stance, and I recognized it as acknowledgement, a mirror of my own trials, endurance, and judgment. Our movements became a silent dialogue, each step a question, each breath a negotiation with the weight of duty, morality, and survival. I understood then that the galaxy is indifferent, but that the Emperor's shadow offers a standard, not intervention, not rescue, not absolution, but a measure by which every act of endurance and every choice is weighed. Survival alone is insufficient. It must be accompanied by clarity of purpose, steadfastness of will, and persistence of conscience. A sudden shudder ran through the cathedral as a distant explosion shook the outer walls, sending dust cascading from the vaults above. Sparks arced from damaged conduits, flickering across the nave, and shadows danced over the mosaic of ruin and devotion. The figure remained poised, unmoved, a testament to discipline and training honed by survival. I raised my bolter slowly, then lowered it again, understanding that the trial here was not of firepower but of perception, restraint, and the capacity to endure without surrendering moral clarity. The weight of the galaxy pressed upon us, and yet, within that pressure, I felt the resonance of purpose. The Emperor's shadow was a burden, yes, but also a guide, shaping endurance in a galaxy that offers no guarantees. I stepped forward, closing the final distance, and in that convergence of presence and awareness, the cathedral seemed to pulse with unspoken acknowledgement. Every battle survived, every choice made in the hive and across the fractured Imperium had led to this nexus of judgment and endurance. The galaxy remained vast, indifferent, and cruel, yet I understood finally that survival is measured not merely by remaining alive, but by carrying the weight of conscience, faith, and purpose intact. The Emperor's shadow is not a force to be wielded, nor a light to be seen. It is the standard by which all actions, all endurance, and all survival are measured, and beneath it the faithful endure, unwavering and unbroken.